Summer reading continues at QPL. Visit summerreading.queenslibrary.org for our full summer reading program schedule, book lists for all ages, and other resources to keep your kids engaged and learning all summer long. Queens Public Library, along with the New York City Department of Education, will provide free lunches for all children under 18 all summer long. Summer meals will be offered Monday through Friday from 1 to 2 p.m. from July 5th through September 1st. Enrollment is not required and there is no cost. Just drop by. For more information about free summer meals and a list of participating libraries, visit queenslibrary.org. Join us on August 3rd and August 4th for our special 2-day summit celebrating 50 years of hip-hop. We will explore hip-hop culture and show how and why hip-hop has evolved into the global phenomenon it is today. Come learn from DJs, breakdancers, and graffiti artists. Talk to hip-hop pioneers, performers, and scholars, and much, much more. Register now for the summit at hiphop50.queenslibrary.org.
Welcome to Queens Public Library's Talk with Tess Gunty, National Book Award-winning author of the novel The Rabbit Hutch. From Publishers Weekly, an astonishing portrait, Gunty delves into the stories of Blandine's neighbors, brilliantly and achingly charting the range of their experiences. It all ties together, achieving this first novelist's maximalist ambitions and making powerful use of language along the way. Readers will be breathless. From The New Yorker, ambitious. Despite offering a dissection of contemporary urban blight, the novel doesn't let social concerns crowd out the individuality of its characters, and Blandine's off-kilter brilliance is central to the achievement. From the New York Times, mesmerizing, a novel of impressive scope and specificity. One of the pleasures of the narrative is the way it luxuriates in language, all the rhythms and repetitions and seashell whirls of meaning to be extracted from the dull casings of everyday life. Gunty also has a way of pressing her thumb on the frailty and absurdity of being a person in the world, all the soft secret needs and strange intimacies. The book's best sentences, and there are heaps to choose from, ping with that recognition, even in the ordinary details. Hi, I'm Brian Alessandro. I have written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Pank, Huffington Post, Lambda Literary, The Gay and Lesbian Review, and I've recently co-edited Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions. Additionally, I co-edited Fever Spores, The Queer Reclamation of William S. Burroughs, an anthology of essays and interviews about Burroughs for Rebel Satori Press. I'm also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the literary journal, The New Engagement. My first novel, The Unmentionable Mon, was published in 2015 by Cairn Press, and my first feature film, Afghan Hound, was produced by Marrier Media in 2011, and it is currently streaming on Plex, Tubi, and Amazon. My new novel, Performer Non Grata, was released in April by Rebel Satori Press. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 10th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. Tess Gunty earned an MFA in creative writing from NYU, where she was a Lillian Vernon Fellow. Her work has appeared in the Iowa Review, Joyland, Los Angeles Review of Books, No Tokens, Flash, and elsewhere. She was raised in South Bend, Indiana, and currently lives in Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining us, Tess.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Congratulations again, by the way, on winning that little award recently.
Yeah, thank you.
It's really quite incredible. For those viewers who have not yet had the privilege of reading The Rabbit Hutch, please tell us briefly what it is about.
Yeah, so the novel takes place in a fictional post-industrial town in Indiana called Vacaville,
Mhm.
and it follows a group of characters, most of whom live in the same affordable housing complex, as their lives kind of collide over the course of 3 very hot days one summer.
And we're going to delve into each one of those characters in a bit, but I'd like to spend one more minute discussing the National Book Award. I'm sure you've been getting this question a lot lately, but what does it feel like to win a prize as prestigious as the National Book Award and for a debut book, no less?
I mean, it's truly unbelievable. I don't think I've internalized it. I think it'll take me a very long time to truly believe it happened. But I mean, I just feel enormous gratitude. I feel like my expectations for my publishing experience were very tempered. I
Hmm.
have a lot of friends who are writers, and it's just so difficult to kind of make a career, get any kind of traction with literary fiction. And so the fact that it's still not just that these awards exist, but the fact that there are whole groups of people that I've encountered over the course of this year who are willing to celebrate literary fiction.
Yeah.
um, I still find it
Heartening.
kind of miraculous. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
heartening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the paperback was just released recently, and you've been on tour with that, right?
Yeah. I just finished. I had like a 5 city tour and I just got back from it the other day. So
Okay, well,
yeah,
welcome back home.
thanks.
So, as you said, the Rabbit Hutch is an apartment complex in Vacaville, which is a fictitious neighborhood in Indiana. Why did you create a fictional town?
I wanted the freedom to pull from a number of cities in the Rust Belt: Flint,
Mhm.
Michigan, Gary, Indiana, Youngstown, Ohio, alongside, of course, my own hometown, South Bend, Indiana. But even more than that, I think I wanted the freedom to depict a place without any of the kind of burden I would feel. I think I would feel kind of unproductive burdens if I were trying to portray my hometown or any real city, because there's just no possible way to represent every imaginable life there.
Right.
And of course, this book's not trying to represent every imaginable life in Vacaville, but I felt that I was free to kind of access a mythical, almost folkloric,
Hmm.
shimmering unreality that
Hmm.
if I had set it in a real town, I wouldn't have been able to access.
I love that. Yeah, so it gave you freedom to really explore and be as creative and imaginative as you needed to be.
Mhm.
Um, and also, on some level, maybe, as you said, symbolic of cities in the Rust Belt.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wanted it to feel. I suppose I didn't want anyone to read it as a kind of attempt to be comprehensively representative of the Rust Belt, but I was really upset and kind of disappointed with how the kind of dearth of fiction that was set in towns like mine.
Mhm.
And this definitely was an effort to reclaim this place as a place of this whole region, really, as a place of importance, as a place where the narratives matter. And it's a region that's often dismissed as flyover country, and
Mhm.
I certainly internalized the idea that the narratives that happen there are not meaningful to other people outside of the region,
Interesting.
and that's a very dangerous idea to internalize. It kind of divests you of political will.
Yeah, I agree with that. And last summer, I had the pleasure of interviewing Diane Seuss, who won the Pulitzer for poetry last year, and
Yeah.
she's of course from Michigan. And we had
Hmm.
a similar conversation about the Midwest and about the Rust Belt and about um, I hate to be cliche and say, but like the coastal elite attitude about the rest of the country,
Hmm.
and what we end up losing um, as a culture and as a literature because of it.
Hmm.
And speaking of Indiana, one of my favorite writers is from your state. Can you guess what I'm going to say? Kurt
Kurt
Vonnegut.
Vonnegut. I was like,
Yeah.
that's the only one that it could have been.
And I know
Yeah.
you're a big fan of science and metaphysics, and of course he was as well. Were you impressed at all by his corpus while growing up in Indiana?
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of his work as a teenager. I was just my one of my best friends kind of introduced me to him as a teenager, and I didn't know he was from Indiana until I'd been reading him for years without knowing that, and then a teacher told me. So yeah, I think there's something about his work that is. It's never happened again. I mean, he was really
Yeah,
the only one that could access this particular space that he
yeah.
accessed, and Yeah, again, he would take these sites of profound sort of mundanity and then
Mm.
infuse them with something magical, something, this kind of unreal, shimmering quality. But even his like kind of strictly realist stories, I find so compelling. Yeah.
I think there are elements of that in your book.
Yeah, I think I
I think you
hope so.
accomplished
Yeah, I
that.
hope
Yeah,
so.
yeah, you certainly do. Um, can you tell us about Zorn automobiles and what it represents to the town and the Midwest generally in your book?
Yes. So Zorn Automobiles was a fictional, car manufacturing company that was very, very closely modeled on Studebaker Automobiles, which is the company that was in my town, South Bend, until the 60s. It operated there for about 100 years. And in its heyday, it was the largest car manufacturing facility in America. And then when it closed kind of abruptly. And I think a lot of the people were just left behind. In my town, there was already the University of Notre Dame. So that became the kind of primary employer of the town, a huge source of town identity and pride. But at the same time, tons of other cities in the Rust Belt that faced a very similar kind of history didn't have some other massive source of economic stability to rely on. And even though Notre Dame was there are tons of people who were left behind. So
Sure.
yeah, I wanted to kind of create, as a kid growing up, I knew so little about Studebaker, but I felt haunted by this kind
Mm.
of past. I was born 30 years after the company closed. And so I wanted to create a sensation of haunting, but I also wanted to take this kind of manufacturing past as an opportunity to think about the American extraction economy and these kinds of cycles of creative destruction that
Mm.
capitalism ordains.
Yeah, and I think you really thoughtfully probed that. And we're going to return to this idea and these themes in a second. But how did the idea of the novel itself come to you?
Um,
I know it's
you
such a
know,
tricky question. When people
yeah,
ask me, I'm always like, I don't really know. It's
yeah.
like it's so
It's
subconscious.
so difficult to access that again, because I think I'm also a very, very micro writer. So I start with, one sentence and really follow it to the next without knowing much about where I'm going. I know that at the time I was really enchanted by polyphonic fiction, and
Mm.
especially contemporary polyphonic fiction. I was really drawn to these like ecosystems of narrative where there were lots of different storylines and people intersecting. And so formally, I wanted to try that out. I was just excited to try that. But then in terms of the content of the book, it really was because I had moved away from the Rust Belt for the first time in my life. I was 22 and I moved to New York for this writing program.
Mhm.
And all of my writing was drawn back to the Midwest. I had never really set anything I'd written there. I've been writing since I was a child, but
Mm.
as soon as I left it, all of my writing was pulled back there. And so I
That's
finally
interesting.
decided, okay, I'm clearly being, there's some kind of gravitational pull, and I need to examine it. And
That's
so I wanted
interesting.
to write a book about this place.
That's fascinating. You said polyphonic, and it made me think of when Elfriede Jelinek won the Nobel Prize in Literature
Mm.
back in 2004, whatever it was. They said that the committee, those who didn't quit because she won the award, do you remember that? There was like a mass exodus. Those who stayed said that they gave it to her because she represented like a river of voices. I thought
Mm.
that was really a beautiful way to capture a writer trying to capture something like this,
Hmm.
polyphonic. There are many characters in your story, but is it fair to say that the central character, the primary protagonist around whom all the others gravitate, is the teenager Blandine Watkins in apartment C4?
Yes, I think, yeah, I kind of made a rule for myself at some point that all of the characters have to be united by her in some way.
And she lives, we should say, with three other teenage roommates, Malik, Todd, and Jack.
Hmm.
And these are all foster kids who have aged out.
Hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about their synergy, their relationship, the dynamic?
Yeah. So these kids kind of meet in a workshop that's supposed to help uh, youth who are in the foster system kind of acquire some life skills before they enter the world. And I think all of them feel, yeah, extraordinarily abandoned by the systems, not just by their parents, but by the systems they were born into. And um, I was really interested in examining a certain kind of like inhabiting a certain kind of male gaze, because it was a
Hmm.
time of my life where I felt that it was like, right, I was writing this kind of during the election, the the 2015 presidential election. And then also I was 22. And so I was so aware every time I was walking around the streets, this kind of like male aggression everywhere I went. And I wanted to try to flip my own perspective and try to inhabit a certain kind of masculinity, a certain kind of violence, and a certain gendered management of power that I felt was being demonstrated over and over again in both the kind of micro and macro levels in my own life. And so these boys kind of take to animal sacrificing to ostensibly to kind of express their admiration and love for this girl, Blondine. But as I wrote them, I sort of felt like they were really trying to sublimate a kind of extreme desire for each other's approval that didn't have any other language except for dominance. Dominance was the language they were taught as like a form of emotional expression.
And I think, your novel does a lot of brilliant things. I think one of the things that it does really, really well is looks at how like these various systems of whether it be, capitalism or the auto industry or abusive men or indifferent parents or desperate parents who are broken, and how so many of us end up orphaned in various permutations because of all of these failures of systems, and how it trickles down from a parent not being able to raise their child and to put them into a foster situation, and then those children having to abuse non-human animals. I think that was really thoughtful.
Thank you.
There. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I should say almost every character in the book is orphaned in some way or another by the time we meet them, whether they've kind of been estranged from their parents or their parents have died. And I was really, I felt like this was a town that was fundamentally orphaned. And so I wanted to explore that, what that does to your kind of your sense of self.
Yeah. The town, you nailed it. The town itself is orphaned by the industry that collapses because of, mismanagement of capitalistic aspirations and ambitions. Coming back to science, there's a real sense of metaphysics in your story. I read in the New York Times an interview with you. You mostly attended Catholic schools, and you went to Notre Dame, as you said, before NYU. And even though you said in the New York Times article that your family doesn't think that you're good at science, you said it, you have a real affinity for it, and especially quantum mechanics or quantum physics.
Yeah.
Blandine regularly reads about a 12th century Catholic female mystic, or several 12th century female mystics. Can you tell us about how your interest in quantum mechanics and your background in Catholic schools kind of intermingled in order to inform The Rabbit Hutch?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, I should say I'm such an amateur. I'm not at all a kind of expert on this, but I think one thing I've been really interested in for a number of years now is the sort of inexplicable mysteries. I feel like from a quantum physics perspective, like what happens on a subatomic level is so much more strange and mysterious than even the scientists themselves understand, which is, I think my entry point into this was the double slit experiment. And if you don't know what that is, you should just YouTube it, because it's very hard to explain without a visual, but it essentially proves that like electrons behave differently, whether or not they're being observed. So the implication is that consciousness affects kind of subatomic realities. And that is just unbelievably strange. Like nobody really understands what that means, or why that is, or there are all sorts of theories. It's some people use it as a defense of the multiverse theory. Some people use it as a defense of we're all living in a computer simulation theory. But for me, what it did actually was kind of open back up a lot of sort of religiously influenced mysteries that were a part of the kind of lore of my childhood, which is like, not only was I was in a really Catholic community, but my parents were super, super Catholic. And my mother specifically, she was in a convent in her 20s, and her kind of Catholicism is really driven by kind of signs and wonders, miracles and visions. And she's one of 12 children. And on her side of the family, there are lots of stories that are just kind of inexplicable. If you don't, of course, the kind of Catholic perspective on it was that that was the narrative I was always told. But as I kind of grew away from the church and didn't, and stopped believing in the faith, I I was still left with these kinds of mysteries, like what to do with these phenomena that I didn't believe people were lying about. And so I do think that science could be an entry point into mysteries for those of us who are agnostic or atheists. And I just feel very, very open to mystery generally, to unbelievable or inexplicable phenomena. I don't feel any need to kind of interrogate it to death or dismiss it.
Sure. And I think, this kind of conversation is really important to have culturally, that you could have a conversation about science without excluding religion, and you could have a conversation about religion without excluding science. I think there could be sort of a synergistic dialectic that could happen.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I mean, to the credit of like my particular Catholic education, I think it was always presented, science was always presented as perfectly compatible with Catholicism, and kind of like it was only meant to enrich one's faith or one's understanding of the complexity of the world. But yeah, even if no matter where you fall on the spectrum of kind of religiousness, spirituality, whatever, I think science can be an entry point to mystery.
I love that. I want to go back to Vacaville for a minute. It is a character itself on some level. I know some writers, I myself am ambivalent sometimes about calling a place a character, but I do think that they very much can be. And I think in your book, Vacaville is a character. What did you most want to convey about the Midwest through Vacaville? I know earlier you said you didn't want it to be an all-encompassing symbol, but what are some of the ideas that you did want to present?
Well, I think the very first thing I wanted to do, the very basic kind of challenge I gave myself, was, could I evoke the kind of purgatorial atmosphere that I felt there when I was growing up on the page? And it was exactly the same sensation I would have as soon as I entered a town that had a similar history to mine. It was a sensation of the afterlife, of kind of indefinite waiting. And growing up in Catholic school, we were taught the term purgatory when I was like 11 or so. And our religion teacher described it as this place of eternal longing and unquenchable thirst and indefinite waiting. And she made it sound kind of like, I was just picturing a kind of waiting room with a very low ceiling and, no natural light and nobody at the desk. And you just didn't know when your name was going to be called. And at the time, even as a child, I felt this sounds so familiar. This sounds like the place where we already live. And there's something about that atmosphere that kind of pulls, I mean, of course, purgatory, and it's like etymology, it's purging. It's supposed to be a place where you purge your sins and then prepare yourself for paradise. And there was something sort of about the atmosphere of my town, to me specifically, where I felt like there was everything was kind of at the surface, like things were kind of getting pulled out of people and pulled out of systems. And a lot of the kind of brutality of the extraction economy was visible there in a way that it might not be in other places. And whether that's, the empty factories, these kinds of abandoned manufacturing lots, or if it's in these monocrops of corn and soybeans that really surrounded the periphery of my town, you can't really escape the means of production, the scale of production that now kind of determines every aspect of economic life in the Western world. And then as I wrote more and more into it and kind of accessed more tenderness and more affection for this place and all of its people, I also wanted to kind of insist on individuality and variousness and diversity, and kind of just insist that the inner lives of these people are just as valuable and as real and vivid and interesting as the lives of anyone else.
Yes, that's great. One of my favorite characters in your book is Joan Kowalski. She's described, I guess, as a kind of a spinster who lives in apartment C2. She works at restinpeace.com, scanning obituaries for insulting comments. Is that a fair description? A mom named Hope is another character who has a phobia of her baby's eyes. She lives with her family in C8. Reggie, a former engineer, and his wife Ida are in C6. You capture, I think, how lonely it can be to live in an apartment. Even though one might be surrounded by neighbors, and this is something I've always felt living in New York City. Please talk more about loneliness, even when one is not necessarily alone.
Yeah.
In New York, you're never alone, but you could be lonely all the time.
Well, yeah, I think that aspect of the book was absolutely born from my time in New York. I was living in this apartment building in Brooklyn that was like the walls were really thin, so I could hear all of these lives sort of playing out around me, but I didn't know anything about the people I was living near. And and I think that I've always felt a kind of extreme curiosity about the people near me. Like even in my neighborhood growing up, my house was just 8 feet from the house next to ours, and the houses in the neighborhood were really close together. And it always seemed, it just seemed so strange to me that we were all inhabiting this space and didn't know anything about each other.
Hmm.
And I think there's nothing like proximity to emphasize loneliness. Like, I think this is
Sure.
why the internet sort of increases one's sense of loneliness. There's nothing like social media to make one feel uh, really, really alone. I think it's sort of like the sort of like rough approximation of the real thing that ends
Hmm.
up just making the real thing seem so much farther away.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's well said. I think
yeah.
that's really apt. Um, Another relationship in the book that I really thought was fascinating was the one between TV star Elise Blitz and her son Moses, whose qualifications to maintain a mental health blog are at the least questionable. On the on the surface, they seem to be quite different from all the other characters, and yet they're quite similar in terms of their despair, their desperation, their regrets, and again, going back to it, their loneliness. And I was also really fascinated by, but I won't spoil it, by what Moses does with glow sticks at a certain point in the book. Can you talk to me a little bit about that character and his mom?
Yeah. I I I realized at some point that having like one interloper would be really interesting. This is a novel about a place, and to have somebody, especially from a very like kind of coastal elite perspective. He's born and raised in LA, Moses is, and he comes to the town for reasons that you find out. But he, I think I was also really interested in I was thinking about sort of means of production, these factories that produced cars, which are so tied to the American dream of kind of independence and mobility. And I was then also thinking about the factories that produce kind of other American dreams. And obviously, the most evident of these is Hollywood. Um, and I wanted to explore how the extraction economy, even when it seems like it's benefiting from someone, it is extracting something from them. So Elsie is this, she's kind of living the American dream. She was born into a working class family. As a child, she gained notoriety as a child actress on this show, and became quite rich and famous quite quickly. And yet by the time you meet her, she's dead. Actually, when you meet her, she's in her 80s, and she wrote her own obituary. But she's clearly been mined of something essential. I was thinking about her as someone who's kind of a natural resource that's been extracted, and it also was just a fun way to explore the ways that these narratives that are created in such different contexts and get kind of uploaded into the rest of the country. The people in Vacaville are watching the show that she starred in. And yeah, the narratives that they're consuming are kind of affecting the way that they think about the ideal American life.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, and this idea of a character writing her own obituary, I thought was really really compelling, and also this having a relationship with someone in terms of memory, in terms of the things that he recalls, and what she had meant to him, and what they had together. Would you mind reading a selection from The Rabbit Hutch for us, Tess?
Sure. I'm actually going to read a bit from Elsie's
Oh, great.
obituary. This is perfect timing.
Yep.
So she does a couple different sections to her own obituary, but this is a section called An Absolutely True Story. Back when my cells behaved, I believed that I would live forever. If you share this belief, do whatever it takes. Go to church, get an app, break formation, get a tattoo, anything to hatch out of this delusion and into the truth. Because one day you will die, I promise, and mortality does not care if you believe in it. All my life I've just tried to have some fun. I was an artist of fun and a failure at everything else. What we need at the end of our lives is a parent or two, a leash and a fence, a bedtime, a tooth fairy, milk on the stove. But if we're lucky, we are furthest from childhood at the end of our lives. If we're lucky, we are closest to our parents, but they evade us until it's officially over. What we get instead of these is a meet cute with death. He is always early. I met Death one March afternoon outside a shoe store in Florida. I was gazing into a fish tank from my wheelchair, seeing myself in the glass, seeing America and the fish, who are busy and doomed and theistic. As usual, I was making plans to rectify the crimes of my motherhood when Death interrupted. I was 85 years old. Sex had long evacuated my body, and yet when he marched toward me, my ovaries did a little jig. I've never found it easy to distinguish between arousal and a fight or flight response. His scent alarmed me. I could have accepted decay, but this scent was anti-life, the scent of absolutely nothing, less alive than rock. He knelt and batted his eyelashes on the top of my right hand. That's how he says hello, how he roils you up. I didn't recognize Death at first, although he emitted an aura of celebrity. "Can I take a selfie with you?" he asked me. I never say yes to a selfie, but then I saw his skiff. "You bet," I said. He snapped 3. Then, in view of the security guard, he slipped his hand into my pocket and took something. After that, he left. The security guard didn't notice. My son was the one I wanted to call. My assistant emerged from the store with 3 pairs of shoes for me. She opened one box like a casket and offered me the ruby walking shoes inside. An absurd gesture, all things considered. She nestled my feet into them with care. "You look like Death," she said. "Anything I can do for you?" I told her to dial my son. She did, although we both knew it was futile. He'd blocked me months before. She feigned surprise. Later, my phone buzzed during tea. I jumped and beamed, sure it was my son. But it was Death. Text from an unknown number. A photo of the thing he took in a vase on a toilet. "How did you get this number?" I typed. I am a slow typer. He sent a rabbit emoji. At once I knew this was, as they say, the beginning of the end. Soon I would have to do a lot of agonizing. "This is it, isn't it?" I texted Death. He sent me a gif of a walrus vigorously nodding, with the caption, "Indeed, indeed, 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 indeed." I wanted Death on my side, so I summoned some friendly banter. In the following weeks, we stayed in touch. I had heard from the clergy that he gives you some time to organize your affairs, so I asked Death for an extension. We negotiated. 3 months, he settled. 1 more birthday. Death is not a barbaric captain. Somebody has to do the dirty work. Nor is he a philosopher, thank God. The last thing you want to do at the end of your life is math. I am not his detainee, and he is not my boss. And I am not his client, and he is not my muse. But neither of us is free. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Really beautiful, Tess. Thank you for reading that. I was really amazed by the letter from Mr. Body that Moses reads in the chapter Game of Clue about the anonymous man's 3 fixations or fears and how he handles them. Again, without giving too much away, because your book is full of really wonderful surprises and revelations, but I want to talk a little bit about this storyline and character and what you were exploring regarding feminism, maybe an allyship, and maybe repressed desire or contempt even.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that chapter just kind of poured out of me in one night. And
Wow.
when I'm first, of course, I revised it a lot, but when I'm
Sure.
first drafting, I try to sort of trust a kind of dream logic and to sort of trust an associative logic.
Mhm.
And so I think I was interested in that particular character. Years before, I'd heard this very long interview with someone who kind of suffered from a similar debilitating fear, fixation, which some people have, which is it's an obsessive fear of hurting someone in your life. And it's, there was some kind of study I read a long time ago about it. And those who have suffered from it, tend to actually have kind of increased empathetic reactions to things that they see. It's a heightened actual sense of empathy, not an absence of it, that creates this kind of obsessive fear.
Yeah.
But I suppose I was in this book, really, I was interested in different forms of entrapment. And of course, that can be physical, that can be financial. But in this case, it's psychological. This is a person who's so trapped inside of his mental illness, and it's a mental illness that doesn't have a very clean diagnosis or recognizable kind of way of manifesting. And I was also thinking in this book so much about the kind of the gendered management of power, and how men are kind of, I just think the kind of socialization of masculinity in the Midwest, the go-to socialization of masculinity, was one that really tried to take all sorts of kind of forms of expression away from boys and men. And that's just it's so clearly harmful to everyone, but especially to those men. So I was thinking about how perhaps this particular man had maybe thought he was free from those kinds of pressures, those kinds of forces, but in this illness, it's manifesting as an obsessive kind of fantasy of violence.
Yeah, for sure. I thought it was really clinically astute of you to sort of capture that and really dissect it. My master's is in clinical psychology, so I really recognize something in the way you were exploring it.
I feel like then I'm so interested in your assessment, because of course I'm not an expert in any of this, and I feel like
well, no, I think you really nailed it though in a really accurate and thoughtful way. There was like an obsessive, or at least obsessive compulsive even, quality to these sort of thought patterns that come around cyclically, and oftentimes these people will seek reassurance, and sometimes the worst thing you can give them is reassurance, because you're reinforcing the need for it. You know, in certain forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, you would actually offer some sort of tough love and say, look, it could happen. The worst thing could happen. We don't know, but it's not happening right now. And all you have is, your moment to moment experience of what is happening. But I thought that it was I was like, did Tess study clinical psychology? I was like, did you have a background in that? This is really good.
I would have, in a different life. And one more thing about that. One thing I read was that sometimes the treatment for people who are suffering from this is like a therapist will give them a weapon, like whatever they're fearing, and just say, okay.
I wish I could talk about the things I would do with the people that I treated for obsessive compulsive disorder, but that might be like a HIPAA violation. So I don't think I can go into it, but I'll just say, yes, I would do things along those lines.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe we could talk about it later when we're done. I don't want to get in trouble. So there's a good deal of rabbits and mice and dogs and goats in your novel, and I love that. Joy Williams once said, in order to give your writing some warmth, put a dog in your story, or put an animal in your story. Please tell us about how the non-human animals in your story, how they sometimes suffer or are sacrificed. We spoke a couple of minutes earlier about how it trickled down to these foster children who were hurting them. It often feels a little bit biblical in your book.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I was reading so much Joy Williams as I was writing this book. I was reading The Quick and the Dead. It was the first book that I read when I started to write this book. It's such a good book. And she uses, I wouldn't say uses animals. It's almost like she invites animals into the story in a way that keeps reminding the reader of a kind of wildness, or a kind of impossibility of dominating an environment. And of course, she's so driven by the environmental crisis. She's a writer who's very, very aware of that in her work.
She just wrote a novel about the apocalypse.
Yeah. Harrow. Yeah. It's
Harrow.
Good. So I think I've become, it's manifold. First of all, I love animals. It's a stupid answer to the question, but I just do. And so I think about them all the time, and I think about the way that the kind of devastation that our sort of environmental destruction is wreaking on them all the time. And also I'm really drawn to folklore and to medieval kind of imagery, both of which use animal imagery all the time. And it's this kind of beautiful, like mythical, I was just reading a collection of Russian fairy tales, and we often think of fairy tales as instructive, kind of morally instructive. But what's odd when you read a lot of them is like it's actually quite morally chaotic. But the one thing that's consistent across these fairy tales, and then also in other like cultural traditions, is that if you treat animals well, you are rewarded, and non-human animals well. And it's not even true for the humans in the story. Sometimes if you don't treat if you treat a human well, it turns out that it's an evil sorcerer or something, and you've been duped. But
Right.
I think I'm increasingly drawn to kind of narratives that decenter the human and
Mm.
make room for this intensely vast biosphere that make room for kind of other animal narratives to be important and to matter. And what's interesting to me is I find I was writing a book. I was helping research a book on the environmental crisis and factory farming a couple years before I wrote this. And so, I think I became even more aware of the kind of environmental torture that so many species, both wild and domesticated, are suffering. But I find that a lot of people find the violence against animals in this book completely unbearable. And I share that view. I have a very, very low tolerance for representations of violence against animals and humans. But what I find interesting about that is there's this intense cognitive dissonance. Like, a few rabbits in this book are sort of mentioned as being harmed, and that's intolerable to us. But we participate. I mean, I say this as someone who's implicated, like in systems of torture on such a massive scale.
Yeah.
Like, I think almost anyone, no matter what kind of perspective they're coming from, what kind of value system they have, would see the conditions of kind of industrial animal agriculture and find them inhumane.
Yes.
And so, I don't expect moral purity from anyone. I've never managed to be vegan for more than a couple months at a time, but
Same. Yeah. I
but
wrestle with that too, though. Yeah.
it's something that I think we should just be aware of. And so, like, kind of creating a micro instance of this kind of violence against animals was a way to think about the more macro violence against non-human animals that is happening all the
Yeah.
time.
I think, yeah, I hear you on that, and I completely agree with you. And it's something I've been struggling with for a very long time. And my great aspiration is to finally commit to veganism, but I've failed so many times at it, and it's a major issue for me. I do suffer. It's like a kind of a self-esteem issue that I
Yeah.
suffer from because I can't make it happen, and I regret it very much so.
But I actually want to say, like, I think that struggle is the noble struggle. I think that the alternative is to simply shut down your mind and to not think about it. And I find that is what most people tend to do. Like, I think most people agree that the way that we kill and grow animals is inhumane, but the way that people cope with it is just by not thinking about it. So I think thinking about it and struggling with it is the noble struggle.
It's a good step in the right direction, I think,
Mhm.
right? There's a discussion about class between Blandine and her music teacher, James Yeager. Centers on morality and their affair and class, and how she feels as though she is the proletariat and he is the bourgeoisie. And I thought that was a great conversation. Please say more about this relationship and their conversation.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't like trying to figure out with spoilers what to say, but I mean, I think it's fair to just say that there's there's a relationship that develops between a 17-year-old student and a 42-year-old teacher at the high school. And I think I drafted that chapter like right before the Me Too movement exploded. And then I was revising it and thinking through it again, as all of these stories were surfacing about sexual misconduct. And one thing I was so grateful to the Me Too movement for facilitating was a more nuanced kind of discussion of consent and power abuse. It wasn't just, I think before there was quite a kind of black and white, very extreme public sort of understanding of sexual assault. And I think that, or sexual abuse. And I think now we're developing ways to talk about this whole spectrum of abuse. And so I wanted to write a relationship where each party kind of consented, and yet it's still extremely damaging, and it's always going to be extremely damaging to one of those people more than the other. And yet I also wanted to make sure that both of them were humans and that they were, represented in a way that I guess I felt like an obligation to inhabit them, really fully try to inhabit them. And so they meet up later, and after they've not been speaking for about a year, and Blondine Tiffany kind of unleashes this this Marxist reading of their relationship. And for me, it did two things. I think it was true to her character. I think she's someone who she kind of retreats into the cerebral actually to cope with interpersonal harm. This is her safe space, is the kind of structural cerebral critique.
Yeah.
And also it was true to the experience that so many people I knew were having, including I was having it too in this time when Trump was president, and we were reckoning with the Me Too movement, which is that all of these kinds of micro offenses, these interpersonal offenses, felt directly tied to the kind of macro political offenses that were being kind of embodied by these very these very toxic leaders, these kind of megalomaniac leaders that were not just in America, but Brazil, China, all over the place. Obviously, Russia. Like this certain kind of dominating, masculinity.
I thought you did. So you did two things that are among my favorite things that writers do in really great literary fiction is you intermingle the micro and the macro, the public and the private, which I love. And then you also very, I thought, aptly captured how the sort of the historic and the political can be sort of tied to the psychosexual, and this idea of kind of calling out the bullies in power and then equating them to the bullies, next door or down the block or at school. Was it really resonated? And then finally, also the other thing was that no matter how sort of deplorable or despicable a character is, you kept them human. You never took the easy way out by making them a one-dimensional evil villain. Nobody is. Nobody. Even the worst people in the world are still human at the end of the day, and it's sort of lazy to just paint them with a single color.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that. That was important to me.
Towards the end of the book, there's a series of illustrations that I understand your brother did.
Yes. Yeah, my brother Nick.
Get some of them. Is that reading? I can't see.
Yeah.
There's like maybe a dozen or more.
Yeah.
They're really great. Can you talk to us about them?
I love talking about this because it was such a joyful collaboration. My brother, Nick Gunty, is an incredible visual artist and musician. And for a long time, I had this in mind. I kind of, in the earliest drafts of this, I always had like comic strip to come. But when the book was finally, when Knopf wanted the book, they said, they gave me permission to do it, to go for it. And the reason I kind of arrived at this was that I tried to write this scene. This is kind of the climax of the book. There's so much going on. It's like a very, very action-packed scene. And I kept seeing it in my mind as though it was something I was remembering rather than inventing. And it was so different from the kind of writing I normally do in terms of, there was just so many sort of collisions happening at once that every time I tried to write it in prose, it was so overwritten or confusing or both. And so finally I thought, well, I keep seeing this sort of as a comic strip. Why don't I just make it a comic strip? I knew I had this character, Todd, who is at the scene. I mean, he's in the scene, and he's an artist. He was always a kind of illustrator in the book. So I talked to my brother Nick, and he was just the ideal collaborator because he understood the character of Todd, he understood the book, and he understood me, and he elevated the drawings. I was thinking of them being a kind of literal representation of the scene. And he wanted to make a more figurative representation of what was going on in Todd's mind and Todd's kind of interpretation of what he was seeing. And so, what resulted was a very fun, very figurative, very enriching, I think, series of illustrations. And I think he really did make me understand Todd better, which was a really surprising, delightful result. Yeah.
It's a great gift to give to a writer to help them understand their character better.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And how amazing, like the two of you got to work on something that was published by Knopf.
Yeah.
Won the National Book Award.
Yeah.
You must be over the moon. Yeah.
Yeah. And Nick's available if anyone needs an illustrator.
Yeah. Well, does he have a website? Can you direct us?
Yeah, I think he does. It's nicholasgunty.com, I'm pretty sure.
All right. nicholasgunty.com. Check him out. Yeah. We're going to be taking questions for Tess shortly, so please start sending them in. I have a few more of my own while we wait. Who are some, this is an obvious question, but I have to ask it. Who are some of your influences, literary or otherwise?
Well, in general, I think Anne Carson is one of the most exciting writers. She's someone who I always feel electrified by when I read her. Maggie Nelson and Claudia Rankin as
Oh,
well. I
yeah.
feel like these kinds of these people who are working kind of between forms are really these like kind of hybrid forms are so electrifying to me.
I read The Argonauts and The Art of Violence.
Oh
Is it?
yeah,
The Art of Cruelty. The Art of
The Art of
Cruelty.
Cruelty.
Back to back last year. I was blown away. Maggie
Wow,
Nelson.
I mean she's such an extraordinary thinker, and the
Yes.
fact that she's
Yeah.
also an incredible poet it really is this perfect fusion. And I love Joy Williams. I love I read mostly poetry actually when I start to when I'm writing. And so there's a book called The Sand Book by Ariana Reins that was really helpful to me when I was writing this. Yusef Komunyakaa, a poet, but also books that were specifically helpful to write this book were N.W. by Zadie Smith, Middlemarch, George Eliot, Ulysses, James Joyce, obviously, and then Great House by Nicole Krauss, and A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan, Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace.
Yeah.
There's so many narrative, multi-layered contemporary novels that I was reading at the time that were really instructive.
That's great. I interviewed Zadie Smith 4 years ago at a charter school that I worked at in the South Bronx, and she was delightful.
Wow.
And we just had a Ulysses program last month.
Cool.
Yeah, well,
I wish I caught that.
Link.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd love to see it.
Some questions are coming in. Thank you for this fantastic Culture Connection book talk, Ms. Gunty. Could you please make a statement on the recent rash of book bans at school and public libraries around the USA? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of easy to become cynical about the state of the world and literature's place in it, but this round of book bans actually evidences literature's enduring power. So while it is, it's insupportable and devastating, it also is a kind of like the ultimate indication that literature really, really matters, and it can be like incredibly transformative. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think the only way to fight this is by insisting. I think that the only way to fight this is by like restructuring the democratic system, making it a true democracy, making one vote count for one vote, restructuring the Supreme Court, because I think all of these changes are actually a minority of people want them, and yet they're in power. And that's been the case my entire life. So the only way to kind of fight against this extremism is by tuning up our democracy and making it a fairer place. But it's kind of above my pay grade.
Yeah, you said it though. I mean, it's very succinctly put. Can you tell us several books and writers that have been most meaningful to you in your life? That was similar to my question, but maybe I don't know. Is there anything that you might have missed that you want to add to?
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, there's so many. I'm just looking at my bookshelf here.
Great.
I guess...
Thank you, Eve. I'm sorry, Eve just put nicholasgunty.com.
Oh, thank you.
So the link is there. Great.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many, I guess I didn't really talk about the kind of older influences. Like when I was first getting into writing as a teenager, Steinbeck was really influential to me. It was the first person, Grapes of Wrath was really the first book that taught me that novels could have this kind of intense social impact.
Sure.
And then I loved Franny and Zoe in high school as well. I read that over and over again by J.D. Salinger. And then I was introduced to kind of T.S. Eliot and Dante and Shakespeare in college, and got to know those kind of more canonical, I guess, influences. But I think Diane Seuss, actually, she just, you referenced her earlier. I just read Frank Sonnets.
So good.
It's so good.
She's amazing.
She's so amazing. And there are three other books I read this year that were so impactful. One was If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English by Noor Naga.
It's on my list. I'm dying to read it.
It's so good. Yeah. I think that you'll really love it.
Okay.
And then there's this book called Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, which I'm reading right now. And it must be a really incredible translation because the music is poetry, and she originally wrote it in Spanish. I'm reading it in English, but and then the other book I'll call out, right, that I just read this year is Primeval and Other Times by Olga Tokarczuk.
I've been really interested in her work for a while. She's been coming up a lot. She's actually she's dead, right? I mean,
she is still alive.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Oh my God, I'm
As far as I
conflating
know.
her. I'm conflating her with another writer whose work is
Yeah.
seeing
No,
a bit of a resurgence.
she's having a total resurgence right now.
Okay,
Yeah. So I can see
yeah,
why you would think there must be a
that's
reason. But
horrible. What a terrible faux
no.
pas. I'm so
No,
Olga. I'm
no,
sorry.
no. She seems like
um,
someone who wouldn't mind.
yeah, she'd probably be laughing at that.
Yeah, she would.
Um, can you discuss some of the storytelling choices of communicating the plot in multiple tenses and multiple forms from multiple perspectives in multiple formats, such as newspaper clippings or online discussions? I thought that made me think of like Jennifer Egan on some
Mm,
level. I know you referenced her a minute ago, but
yeah.
can you speak to that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, I was so enchanted by these kinds of multi-textual narratives because it was a way of sort of repurposing the trash of life into art, um, and reclaiming these really unlikely sites of transformation as sites of transformation, like a comment section or something, a site of transcendence, really.
Mhm.
So I was really drawn to like places or materials that seemed least likely to offer transcendence, but often did in my experience online, which is like
Sure.
there are these little moments of extraordinary beauty and kindness or humor or cruelty, on YouTube comment sections or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I feel like it's like this direct access into the subconscious of the internet, and that's really fascinating to me. But really often, when I made a formally unconventional choice, it was a kind of solution to a problem. Like there's an obituary because I needed to include Joan's work, and I needed to kind of pull Joan's work into the text. There was a newspaper clipping because I needed to explain something that had happened, and this was just like the most efficient way to do that. We talked about the drawings already. But I think almost always was a solution to a problem. And the person I'm first and foremost trying to interest is myself as I'm drafting. So if you don't interest yourself, no chance of interesting a stranger. So I'm
Yes.
always trying to kind of surprise myself or do something that challenges me, kind of throw me into an unfamiliar terrain, because that's where discovery happens. And yeah, when I'm writing, that's what I'm trying to do generally.
Yeah, I agree with that process. Yeah, you said it. If you're bored, your reader's going to be bored, and so
Hmm.
you have to keep yourself engaged first.
Right.
What are you working on now? Can you talk about it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm working on a second novel. I think of it as divided into three parts. And it's interested in quantum superposition. We were kind of
Oh,
talking about that earlier, but
cool.
kind of as a jumping off point, I don't think it would be considered science fiction. But yeah, I think it's so early. I feel like that's all I can say about it. But it starts in the post-industrial Midwest and then it wanders elsewhere.
Will it be released by Knopf?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll look out
Hopefully
for that.
2024. Yeah.
I can't wait. Good luck with it.
Thank you.
The book is The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. It is the winner of this year's National Book Award. Tess, thank you so much for this hour.
Thank you. I really appreciated your questions.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for watching, and have a safe, wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everyone.